you think life is simpler as time evolves, for some, it can be more complicated when facing issues about health, estate plans, probate, long-term care, and more. That's why Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell hosts ElderTalk with TuckerAllen, providing intelligent answers for those thinking about their future. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of ElderTalk. This week I'm flying solo. And I've decided to take this time to talk about something that I'm interested in, and I think you should be interested in, but I realize there's a risk in doing a show where I talk about a particular topic that could seem technical, and I risk the possibility that many of you will be bored. So I hope that's not the case, because I think if we think about the things that are important to people who are retired, among the most important things are the ability to continue to purchase goods and services on the fixed incomes that they have. Some people will continue working into retirement. I think that's a healthy thing. We've talked about that before on the show. But the reality is that there's only so much what economists call elasticity, meaning the ability of people who are in retirement to kind of continue to participate or to return to the workforce. There's only so much room for that, in part because of limitations people have physically, even cognitively, and some just decide as a matter of lifestyle that they're not going to go out and continue to work for their income as they age, and they want to use that time for family and other interests. So that was kind of the plan that perhaps many of us have had our entire lives. We worked hard in our youth, our middle age, our early old age, and we now are determined that we take some time and give it more to family and grandkids and whatnot. So with that in mind, among the most important things to think about is inflation, because what it threatens to do, it threatens to reduce to rubble the plan that hopefully you created. Hopefully you have, if you follow the advice on the show, you've talked to a financial advisor, perhaps more than one. You may have had less formal conversations, for example, with a CPA or others. But in any case, on some level, I'm willing to bet that the substantial majority of you have taken time to develop a budget. And that budget assumes a certain level of income. That income is only relevant if the dollars retain their purchase power. So if it turns out that you do in fact have in nominal dollars, if you're counting on, for example, $3,000 a month income, it may be poor satisfaction to you that you may end up having $3,000 income, but the price of everything has gone up 2 or 3 times, and that's kind of what inflation's all about. It doesn't mean that the nominal dollars that you put in your budget are not going to be there. As a matter of fact, you may have substantially more than the nominal dollars in nominal terms. But the point about inflation is those additional dollars do not keep up with the reduction in purchasing power that is, the pernicious effect of inflation. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not an economist. I have an interest in the subject, and I read about it, but I'll issue a disclaimer at the outset that I don't consider myself an authority on this topic. But I can speak to you as somebody like you who thinks about it, and I would like to work through some of the things that I've noticed that you may not have. You may not follow this as closely as I do, but I think it's a very interesting debate that's been going on the last several years. To a great extent, it's been going on the last 10, 12 years. If you look at the couple of years leading up to the Great Recession, there was a period when we had Greenspan, of course, in the Federal Reserve, and we saw the supply of money go up fairly substantially. And, of course, that fueled the increase in housing prices. And so the Federal Reserve realized that perhaps they were putting too much stimulus into the economy, so they pulled back some, but not in time. And so the Great Recession comes, housing prices collapse, and of course much of that was due to mortgage and all those derivatives that were created these securities that were created out of loans on houses in real sophisticated and numerous ways that were given too much value. So when the music stopped, then all of a sudden those prices come crashing down. So really that was kind of the impetus for what became a housing collapse, was really largely what was happening in the investor market for these securitized investments. So since then, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the Fed felt it necessary to pour stimulus into the economy. They did that through quantitative easing. They did through purchasing of securities in the open market, federal securities until very recently. Then they started buying some AAA, maybe even B-level corporate bonds. So they've gone beyond what was the original mandate of the Federal Reserve, but that's for a different discussion. But what's interesting, though, and what many people question as they look at what lies ahead is, why has there not been inflation that's been accompanying all this increase in money supply, which is the effect of it? One thing you can do is you can lower, and the Federal Reserve has lowered the discount rate to make it easier for banks to access money, to incentivize them to access money. They've been pouring money into the economy by way of purchasing these securities. That's additional money. So we know that there's been a huge impact on the money supply. And people have been asking, even before this whole pandemic issue came up, was why is it that we're not seeing inflation? And many people who forecast inflation along the way, some were characterized as doomsdayers. We all know some examples of those people. Some of you may follow some of those people, and I'm not inclined to criticize them too harshly, if at all, because I understand the reasoning was you just can't pour this much new money into an economy and still manage to keep the value of the dollar. It seemed reasonable, but there are explanations now that get close to explaining it. Maybe they do explain it, but the point is, when you have among your best and brightest economists still arguing about the phenomenon, it's hard for you to have confidence in any particular view. But I think at the end of the day, it makes a whole lot of sense to come back to fundamentals. I mean, remember why we're asking this question. We're asking this question because in the position of a retiree, it's critical for you to be able to predict, is there going to be significant inflation over the next 10 to 20 years? That's a core concern. So it's toward that end that you want to think about the fact that now we've gone into this epidemic where literally, since the pandemic started, which I'm looking at a chart here, that at the time, if we go to 2020, about mid-year, well, before mid-year, probably March, it's about $4 trillion that was pumped into the economy, or that was the level of the new money, and now it's up to $6.5 trillion. It's a 52% increase in money supply just in the last, 18 months. I mean, that's amazing to me. 52%. So many of you are thinking, well, how can you possibly increase that dollars to that extent and not have an impact on prices? Well, some would say, well, you can't, and you see that now. You see that we have an inflation rate, depending on which calculation you use. I buy the argument that many do, where they sort of adjust the CPI and they look at those things that are really reflect day-to-day living for most people, and they end up anywhere from 5 to 10 to 12%. Just the CPI itself was at 5.2, I think, percent in the last reporting. Now, it's true that the Fed uses it's a different calculation. I don't know exactly the details of how it's calculated, but it's called personal consumption expenditure. It's a little different from CPI, but not fundamentally different, but it does produce a lower number. So they would hurry to say, well, it's true that we have more inflation than we, the Fed, expected, definitely more, but it's not as bad as the CPI makes it look. But the Fed is acknowledging that this hasn't gone quite the way they had anticipated. The Fed felt, this is transitory, so there's no need to have any real concern. And the reason that the way the Fed was reaching that is not silly. And some people say, well, how can they come up with the idea that it's transitory? And incidentally, what does transitory mean? Because originally the Fed suggested it was a couple months. Then it became 3 months. Then we get into the summer, and clearly they're saying, well, it's going to go on a little longer. But they're still comfortable using that word, but they could see they're redefining it a little bit to be a little longer. So suddenly it's become so squishy that transitory has no meaning for most of us. But let me be devil's advocate here for a second. So the way the Fed arrived at this is they looked at each of the individual components of the basket that comprises, in their case, personal consumption expenditure. So it's a basket of goods, so you can take each category. I mean, it's given a certain percent of the whole, each category. For example, grocery store items. Used cars were among the most influential components in this most recent number. Real estate, housing, it's not real estate per se, but it's the rental or monthly cost of housing, which would be the equivalent to a rental price. Commodities, certain and specific commodities. So you have this very detailed breakdown that comprises the CPI too. So both of these indexes have very detailed bunch of categories. So it's not a crazy thing for the members of the Fed, their economists, to work through each of those items on that list and say, is this something that's related to supply chain? So let's take used cars. Used cars as an example. I mean, we've seen crazy numbers with used cars. Do we think that that's something that is really attributable to some longer-term trend and the increase of prices, or can we say with confidence that this is really related to getting the right semiconductors, and the semiconductors are among the biggest problems with the cars, but there are some other commodities, steel, metal, other forms of metal that are needed. So can they look at that category and say with confidence, well, this big increase is largely related to supply chain? That argument could be made, not entirely, but I think we can agree that you could go down that list and look at particular items. Lumber. Now, lumber, that's an example where they were largely correct in that we saw a 40% decline in the price of lumber after it had gone up 60%. So you're still left with a substantial increase year to year. If you were to say that's the rate of inflation, it's a double-digit increase. So I just want to at least acknowledge that when the Fed says that they think it's transitory, it's not that they're just holding their finger up in the air to see which way the wind's blowing. Instead, it is an effort to look at each of these components and ask as to each one, to what extent is there a lot of evidence that this is due to transitional things, such as supply chain primarily. And there are. And when you look at commodity products, like agricultural products, clearly there's some supply chain issues, less perhaps in agricultural than, say, in the metals. Metals are, depending on what we're talking about, those have been big deals, especially getting some things out of China. So transportation's difficult. When there's this incredible shortage of truckers, for example, people who are doing on-land transportation, not to mention transatlantic and trans-Pacific transportation. I mean, there are things going on that I think any of us would acknowledge. Yeah, this is not due to what we think of as a general rise in prices, which is what inflation's about. Remember, inflation's not really a particular thing, or even 5 or 6 or 7 things. The definition of inflation means a general rise in prices. So we do have, I think, a general rise, but if you end up pulling out among the most influential factors in raising those costs, and it turns out that those are attributable, or most prominent components, and it turns out that those are attributable to these supply chain issues, then I get it. You might reduce or adjust the inflation, the facial amount, the nominal amount of inflation that is cited for the CPI. So that's fair, but how far do we go with that? And I guess the point we all have to acknowledge is, even when you make adjustments for supply chain, it doesn't get you back to anywhere near the inflation that we've seen for the last 10 years. which has been substantially under 2%. I mean, the Fed couldn't even get to 2%. They struggled. They thought, well, if we keep issuing more money, we'll get to that. But it just hadn't happened. But it is a weird thing because inflation historically is a phenomenon that's hard to spot coming. It occurs kind of like a flash flood. It's where it's raining and everything's okay, and it's raining, everything's okay, and then all of a sudden it's not. And it's not in a really bad way. That's the history of inflation. It usually doesn't creep up very slowly so that there's ample warning. Remember, inflation is not just an economic phenomenon. Inflation at the end of the day is about consumer expectations. So if people believe there's not going to be any inflation, then just that belief in a way means there's not, because it means that they don't hurry to go out and buy things. They're more inclined to save. They don't fear a loss of purchasing power. So they behave in a way that almost creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if everybody believes that there's not going to be inflation, then guess what? I mean, there's not, to a point. I mean, it's not entirely a psychological phenomenon whenever you imagine tripling, for example, the money supply. But it does assume that there is a behavioral, psychological component. That's a problem, incidentally, I've had always with economics, is at one time the business schools correctly said we don't want economics considered in the business program. So in most universities, even to this day, economics is not in the business school. So, but they want to be, meaning it's funny, they end up in the top echelons of corporations and banking firms and whatnot, making decisions that affect, the money around the world, and perhaps the most influential voices, many would argue, in the ear of CEOs and others. And yet it's odd that they're not considered worthy of being the school of business, because the argument was it's a social science, it's behavioral, it's not really about numbers, it's really about people's behavior. And that's true. I mean, if you look at all the laws of economics, they all hinge upon human behavior. And most of us think that human behavior is not entirely determined. It's not like, the way we might assume some animals behave. We think there's something different about human beings, and there's some autonomy, there's some unpredictability about us all. So the idea that you can have economics as a perfect science, or anywhere close, I think is kind of a fool's errand. But you still have, though, economists that will state rules, and one rule they would state, and matter of fact, they state many rules, but a lot of which have been challenged in recent years, and that's a whole different discussion. I'm sure it would bore you. And again, I don't pretend to be an authority on these things. To me, it's an interesting subject. I like to read about it. I think it's fun. I love to talk to people about it. But what I should do is have an expert on this show and talk about this. Those of you who really have an interest in this topic more generally than just the subject of inflation as it pertains to the next 10 to 20 years. But the point I'm making, though, is that the money supply, there is a behavioral component. There's no question about it. Let me give you an example. Let's assume those who say, well, inflation, the definition of inflation is a dramatic increase in the money supply. And I've heard people say that. That can't be true, because that is assuming that a substantial increase in the money supply has to produce higher prices. So we have, a 52% increase in the money supply, arguably, in the last 18 months? So wouldn't that be like night follows day? It means that we'd have to have, 52% increase in prices, or at least some substantial increase? And I think we all agree we've not seen that. I don't think any of us expect that. Probably some of us do, but I have to tell you, I'm cynical, but I don't expect that. But anyway, so why hasn't that happened? Well, let me give you an example of why it's not enough to increase the money supply. And this is where the behavioral component comes in. Let's assume then that this money supply is increased 52%. What happens if the people who receive that money decide to all put it under a mattress? This is just an illustration. Let's assume that, and I'll make this simpler. Imagine an economy in which there are 30 people. So 30 people is the entire economy. So you increase money supply 52% among these 30 people. What would happen if all 30 of those people were to take the money and put it under their mattress or put it somewhere where it's not spent or placed in circulation? And there are various ways to do that. You can, if it goes into a bank account, for example, and that money is not in turn turned around and invested, meaning it's lent out in some form to business, for example, that wants to expand. That's the way money sort of ramifies through the economy. Just for the sake of discussion, to make a point here, let's assume that they place the money in their home somewhere or somewhere where it's not spent. So there you have an example, 52% increase in the money supply. Would there be any inflation in that scenario? No, because the amount of money that's circulating, which is what, is the way inflation occurs, is money circulating and the quantity of that goes up. I mean, just with that little crazy example, you see my point. It's not enough to just increase the money supply. The money has got to circulate. And that's where you hear this word come around. And I hate to use technical terms because I think it confuses the point. And yet there are some that you need to know, and many of you do know, I know. But where you hear a lot about velocity is simply a matter of saying that example I gave you, where you increase the money supply and people take it, they take the money in whatever form they get it, and they put it under their mattress. That's zero velocity, because that velocity is the number of times that a dollar changes hands over a period of time in the economy. So if you use that as a definition, then velocity is zero. So in order to get the money going and to have the effect of that 52% increase, you've got to have it circulating. So you want lots of velocity. Even a little velocity is going to mean some increase. And the more velocity, the more you're going to see that number go up until it's thoroughly absorbed into the economy, the 52%. And I don't know what level of velocity that would be, but it certainly means that the dollars have got to be being spent. So in this case, in America, the argument was that money was simply not being spent over the last 10 years. It was being invested, so you saw capital assets going up a lot. So we know money was poured into the economy the last 12 years, let's say since the Great Recession. And we know that at least until the start of the pandemic, did not produce any significant inflation. And even when the Fed pressed the gas pedal down further, it still didn't seem to. It's kind of like they're pressing the gas pedal and the economy's not going any faster, and they keep dumping money into it. But we do see evidence that the money's gone into the economy, but where do we see it? We don't see it in the pockets of working class people. We don't see it in the pockets of most middle class people. Where it shows up is in the increase in values of capital or tangible assets. So that includes the stock market, it includes real estate, it includes business assets. Businesses have gone up in value. So it ends up being dollars that never quite make their way down to Main Street. So the dollars, in this case, they're not going under a mattress, but they're not going into circulation in the way that the Fed was wanting. And the problem was that it gets issued in the top echelons of the economy through money, through the purchase of these securities. And it produces incredibly low rates of interest because these lenders who are getting this money most directly through the Fed, they're prepared to make loans available. And when the Fed also is competing to buy these bonds, the effect of that means that the interest rate goes down. So, they're buying a bunch of these bonds, which means they're lending. So they're lending lots of money, so it pushes down interest rates. And so what happens with that? Well, it's not so much affecting Joe Six-Pack and people that in neighborhoods across America and suburbs, and not to mention inner cities. They get some benefit, and that's what we see in the data. We don't see that there's been no benefit, but it's been grossly disproportionate to the benefit that these policies have produced in the upper echelons. So you don't call this velocity in the sense that it increases inflation. It's a different form. It's not as bad as putting under the mattress because there is some leakage when you pour it into these capital assets that do produce some benefit. That's the reason, many have boasted that rate of poverty has gone down. People have been lifted out of poverty to some extent in the last 12 years. Employment rate's been pretty strong. It's not been bad. And most people, if you're in a middle-class job, you've seen your income probably go up. Not anything to write home about, but you've seen definitely improvements in the last 12 years. So the issue, when you see rioting and the Wall Street movement against the top 1% or 2%, that really is a reaction to the growing disparity. It's not an argument. They may argue, but it's wrong to say that the poor have not benefited in the last 12 years. They definitely have, and middle class, et cetera. But it's the disproportionality. If you look at the distribution of income within the United States in the last, 15 years, we'll say, 20 years, you could even go back. But certainly you've seen it worsen far more in Europe as well as in the U.S. in the last 12 years. And that, I'm arguing, is a phenomenon of the Fed's loose stimulus policies, is that they are their goal is not to make the rich richer. I don't believe that. I mean, I'm not a fan of the Fed at all, but I'm not one of those who think that this is an evil conspiracy. I think it's incompetence. I think it's I think it's a philosophy of the role of government that's far beyond what was intended for this nation. Yeah, so I'm a big critic of the Federal Reserve, but I don't believe it's a conspiracy to make the rich richer. I think that they are not capable of getting this money to be sprayed into the hands of individuals on Main Street. I think that they've come up with various ideas to try to force this money into the sort of mainstream that you would see. You'd see inflation go up, and the Fed would regard that as a wonderful thing up until recently. And I think even now they probably regard it as a good thing. So what the money was doing, though, was it wasn't going under mattresses in individuals' homes. It's going under mattresses, so to speak, of very wealthy institutions and wealthy individuals, stock traders, real estate speculators. So it was cheap money where, whether it's borrowed, whatever form it makes its way into Wall Street's coffers. The point is, it's cheap money, and it's lots of it. And so it's sloshing around, and so what happens is the Dow goes up. I mean, here we have 3 records, and all 3 of these major changes: S&P, NASDAQ, Dow, all 3 just in the last few days set new records. And they've set new records multiple times over the last year and a half, and really over the last 10 years. So it's been a wild ride for the stock market. And so there have been people getting richer. And incidentally, some of you have gotten richer, in fairness. I think some of you are out there saying, well, yeah, I've seen my retirement account go up significantly in the last 10 to 12 years. So it's not just the rich. But this point I'm making, though, about the inequality of distribution is shocking how much it's changed. So even though all boats have gone up, that's true, but I'm reluctant to give you the exact numbers, because I'll inevitably get something wrong. But I can tell you that when you look at the number, the percentage of total wealth that's in the hands of the top, say, 2%, it's stunning how that's changed. And it's up to, like, I can't resist saying, it's like 60% of all assets, incomes, a similar thing. So don't hold me to the 60%. It's shocking, though, I'll tell you that. And a lot of that has occurred in the last 12 years. This phenomenon's happened, but you've not seen inflation happen, in part for the reasons I mentioned. Now, here's another interesting point about inflation. And again, this represents that naive idea that I think existed even by the Fed, in going all the way back to the 90s, I believe, was that you can control inflation and you can create a healthy level of inflation just by using the Fed's policies. The Fed felt that we got this. We have the machinery to assure a proper level of inflation. And they looked at the 90s and they thought, wow, look at how well we did. And Greenspan I probably couldn't resist becoming a little self-congratulatory for how well the economy did from his ascension to its chairman position and throughout the 90s and then the 2000s. And there were some misjudgments there, which he would acknowledge, and he has to take some responsibility for the Great Recession, though he wasn't he wasn't the chairman at the time. Still, I think that to put it on Bernanke is not fair, and I don't think that. I think that we all have to recognize that the policies were not as good as they could have been, but they had a whole lot of naive confidence in the power of the Federal Reserve, is my point. And yet they weren't able to affect that rate. And here's one other example that has caused Federal Reserves throughout the world, or I should say central bankers throughout the world, to think about the effect of increasing or manipulating money supply through interest rates or discount rates or whatever way it might have been, is what happened to Japan. This is the most troubling, or the most interesting, I should say, example when you start thinking about what lies ahead for America with this huge increase in money supply. And some of us, and I'm one of them, believes that there will be inflation, for substantial inflation over the next 10 to 20 years. I'm personally confident of that. Will it be above 7, 8, 9%? I don't know about that, but I certainly would see it being in the 5 to 6% range. And this isn't just my opinion. Again, I'm not an expert, but I read experts, and among those, the ones I find to be most credible are the ones who say, yeah, there are some good reasons to think that this will stick. But let me make a point to you before you conclude that this massive increase in stimulus is going to produce inflation, or that the inflation we see now is not going to be transient. That will not be long term. That will in fact turn out to be transient. So this is an argument perhaps that many Powell would probably make to you now. And that's what happened to Japan in the 90s. It's really interesting. Japan, those of you who are old enough, I think it's all of you, are old enough to remember this period. The 80s were pretty good. 70s were crazy with inflation, right? And then we go into the 80s. Reagan, early years of Reagan was tough because we were recovering from the Carter years. But quickly, the economy started moving forward in a big way in the 80s. Japan, remember, it was the talk of the world at the time. Japan's buying the world. Japan was in the 80s kind of what China became in the 2000s in many ways. Everybody was talking about China. Remember, there was this fear that the Japanese were going to buy up America? They were buying all the great hotels, Park Plaza, for example, I think they bought in New York City, and all these landmarks. Was it Madison Square Garden too, I think? So they bought all these massive, wonderful landmarks across America. They had all this money to spend. And so Japan was just perceived as being this tsunami that was going to dominate the world, right? That never happened. And it kind of came to a crashing halt, more or less, around the years early 90s. And that's when suddenly Japan saw an inability to keep the party rolling, to keep the level of economic activity that they had going. Now, there's lots of ways to express this. They didn't see their GDP didn't grow as much. Their unemployment started to move up some. Inflation, which they had thought was a pretty good thing, had kind of dissipated. So inflation in the 80s in Japan was wonderful. I mean, it wasn't the sort of runaway inflation that you think is a terrible thing that, always has a bad ending. It wasn't that sort of inflation, but it was a strong level of inflation that really just increased Japanese optimism. I mean, the last people that expected this crash to occur, for Japan to become, I won't say irrelevant in the world, but to cease to be one of the primary players, the last to expect that were the Japanese. Things were going so well. And economists talk about, well, what happened to where things came to a sudden halt almost, pretty quick halt in the early 90s. Well, some argue that there was a lot of over expenditure, that they spent far too much in capital expenditures, that perhaps they invested too much, that they stretched too far, that maybe compensation for wages and whatnot just got too high. And that's kind of a Japanese thing where employees are like family members. So you think more about first about your employees, then about your customers. So that's kind of a cultural thing. So maybe there was excessive commitments there. Maybe the economy, Japan as a whole, simply became too much of a debtor nation. There was a lot of consumption in Japan at the time. So what happens then, and this is the psychological factor, but suddenly Japan slowed down very, very quickly in the 90s. And it was a shock to their system, and they started trying to figure out what's happened. Their central banking authority immediately started injecting stimulus. So Japan's idea was, we're going to get out of this, and the Federal Reserve is the way to do it. And remember, Japan, though they adopted a lot of ways that were like the United States, they still were very much about a controlled economy. I mean, not like China, but still, their philosophy was very corporatist and statist, and in a capitalist way, to the extent you can have those three words go together, and I think they do in this case. They weren't communist by any means, but they felt that there should be government policies, I'll put it that way, that should govern economic development. I think that they were prepared to do what was necessary to try to get the economy rolling, and they dumped a lot of money. But here's what should make all of us pause, and this should be the example that the world looks to, and many have looked to and commented about in trying to figure out what lies ahead for America. Japan launched on what was first thought to be a lost decade. Then it became a lost 2 decades. And there are some that will argue it's a lost 3 decades. If you look at how much Japan has grown in the last 3 years, their GDP, last 3 decades, again, I haven't looked at these numbers in a while. It's under 10%, way under 10%. It's shocking to think that an economy that was so full of promise and was so on fire, and yet not so much in a crazy way. It wasn't like a drunken, party where there was a lot of irresponsibility. We all think of Japan as having good work habits, good investment habits, good cultural habits. So it was a little stunning to the world when things slowed down so suddenly, and then Japan wasn't able to fix it. So when central banks think about the extent of their power and the extent of their capabilities to fix things, they look at Japan, and some it gives pause to. Others hurry to distinguish Japan. I'll talk about that in just a second. But I think that the lesson is that you can spend a lot of money, you can dump it into the economy through various ways. And the way we've not talked about so much today, and it really deserves some attention, is fiscal spending. And many would argue fiscal spending is the way you get money into Main Street. You don't get it onto Main Street through the Fed. And I'll be sure to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So I don't want to bore you guys with this with today's show. But I do want to talk enough to where I think that you walk away knowing a lot more than you did know, hopefully, or at least thinking differently about it than you did. So Japan stands out as an example to which we will either be like Japan, in which case we're launching into a period that could be decades where we just don't see the sort of growth that we at one time saw. And there's kind of a malaise. But incidentally, Japan hasn't suffered a depression. They've had recessions, but not a depression. So the fate of Japan is not a particularly horrible one, but it's not the one we want, right? And it's not good for retirees. But I'll tell you this, their fate is better for retirees than runaway inflation. Because in their case, one thing they didn't have was much inflation. And they couldn't, the various reasons for that, there are various, but one that stands out in particular is the fact that, people were not out spending. I mean, Japanese people, when suddenly they realized that jobs could be in doubt, some of the companies were thinking about laying off, but on the other hand, culturally, you're not supposed to do that in Japan. I mean, if you work for Toyota, you've joined a family, and you've joined it for life, and there's this implicit, if not explicit, commitment on the part of Toyota that they're going to provide you that. So companies were slow to lay off, but they did do decreases in compensation. But there was definitely a change in consumer behavior, and they found that they couldn't generate the sort of velocity of cash that was going on in Japan for so long. And they did try, and I want to talk just briefly about the role of fiscal spending, because we're seeing that really it's not for the first time. There was fiscal spending in shortly after the Great Recession in the Biden the Obama administration, where there was a couple of trillion, which we thought that was shocking at the time, remember? And now we're talking like $6 trillion, potentially through fiscal spending. So we don't know how much of this is going to pass in the Biden administration, but the point is, it's funny how at one time we thought $2 trillion was just too much to even fathom on the part of the federal government spending. Remember, this is fiscal versus Fed. I don't want to diminish this. Many of you, I know, fully get that distinction, but I always want to allow for the possibility that some, it's confusing when you're talking about the Fed injecting money and then the Biden administration and Congress is thinking about injecting money. Yeah, those are two different forms. Fiscal spending is spending which is approved through the federal government. It's borrowed typically through the Fed. The Fed buys securities that are issued by bonds that are issued by the federal government. So it still, incidentally, is money that's being generated through the Fed, but it's being initiated through Congress. So fiscal spending is a little different from Fed spending, because what fiscal spending means that it gets into the hands of Congress, and then or in the federal government, and they get to choose where they're going to spend it. I think there's a better shot of fiscal spending producing velocity of cash and producing sort of a positive inflation to the extent that we're talking about low levels of inflation. I think that fiscal spending is far more likely to affect inflation. And for purposes of this show, we're talking about negative inflation. So we're talking about the kind where it's not healthy. And that certainly most people agree beyond 2%, but I'm thinking beyond 4, 5, 6%, meaning where it has a huge impact. If you map out the impact of a 2 to 3% higher rate of inflation on your spending power over 3 to 5 years. Remember, that compounds. So when you're doing the calculation of a difference in inflation of 2%, for example, that difference compounds year after year. So you're not it's not like simple interest, it's like compounded interest. So you can see a huge impact, maybe a reduction by half of your purchasing power remember the rule of 72? So whatever times 72 is the period of time it takes to double. That's just a calculation trick. And if you apply that, though, you can see where, depending on the length of time and the rate of interest, you could easily have half your purchasing power gone in 10 years. And that's a crisis for somebody that's retired. It's less a crisis if you have a family. Now, I get it. People who may watch this show that are younger, if there are any of you, then you may think, whoa, that's a big issue for us. We have kids to think about college. It is. But I argue that when you have your youth, your vitality, your place in the workplace, in the economy, you can compensate in ways that retirees cannot. So I do believe that inflation is a huge crisis, a much bigger crisis for older people than it is for younger. So I point to Japan to make a point, and that's that could be the fate of America. But some would say, Japan had different problems. Japan is unique. We can't compare that to America in 2020s. And that may be true. There are some differences. But I want to close, though, by pointing out a point that was actually raised in a book that I read just recently. And it's a book I can recommend to you. It's called The Great Demographic Reversal. So it sounds really boring. If somebody said to me, I want you to read this book, it's called The Great Demographic Reversal. Sounds a little academic, so I get it. So y'all may have no interest in reading this book. But it's really interesting that the authors who wrote this book, they have great credibility in the economic community, and I think legitimately so. The primary author, Charles Goodhart, he's a guy who's affiliated with London School of Economics. He's clearly a thinker, and this book has gotten a lot of attention. After I read it, I saw an article that relied on it talking about how demographic forces may affect the economy in the next 10 to 20 years. This is an article in the Wall Street Journal that just I saw a week or so ago. This book's been out for a while. It came out in 2018. So it's not out to talk about the pandemic. And I really don't think the pandemic is. I think if we focus too much on the pandemic, we're losing sight of the next 20 years. I think that the pandemic is a huge deal. It's this historical event. But beyond that, I think, we'll have vaccines we deal with and residual virus and whatnot, so that'll recur from year to year. But I think you can't focus on now and extrapolate from that for the next 20 years. I think that's a mistake. I think instead, I'm more interested in before the pandemic, that data, to pick up with that data and go forward. Again, the pandemic will have some effects. I don't want you to think I'm being totally dismissive, but I don't think we can judge what's going to happen the next 20 years by what's happened the last 18 months. So this one, the Great Demographic Reversal, I'll give you in a nutshell this argument. This argument says that what we've seen happening in the last 20 years, we can maybe go back a little further, I guess. Their main focus is 30 years. So, it's mainly seen since the year 2000 because of the role of China. Still, the point they're making is the world has seen general prosperity for the last 30 years in a lot of ways. We've seen economies, for the most part, grow, Japan excluded perhaps, but we've seen a lot of growth. Even in the emerging economies, even the third world, they're all better off than they were 30 years ago. And they were fairly consistent improvements. Now, it wasn't equal improvements. Some did better than others, obviously. But it's been a pretty good 3 decades, aside from the Great Recession and ignoring the pandemic. So putting aside those two events, we've had 30 years of pretty impressive things. And how is that? I mean, how is it that we've seen cost of things go down? A lot of things, believe it or not. And that's a factor I didn't mention, but I think it's a factor in the low inflation rates we've seen the last 3 decades, is that technology has allowed some things to go down. But also globalization and the opening of China are probably the 2 biggest events that explain the fact that costs have gone down, standard of livings have been able to go up in the last 30 years. And we've taken it for granted, but it's a phenomenon that they haven't seen much in history over that long a period of time. But the reason it's important to acknowledge that is because if that explains to a great extent what has happened in the last 30 years, then what does that portend for the next 10, 20, 30 years? And that's the point of this book, is they're saying, look, the best things that we've seen over the last 30 years were not due to the Federal Reserve. They weren't due to fiscal spending, and they spend a lot of time discounting the impact of the Fed. Though many people, conventional wisdom has it that the Fed, focusing on the U.S., that the Fed has been the most influential factor in what's happened economically in the last at least 20 years. And most would say 30 years, but certainly the last 20 years. And they would say of central banks really everywhere. Definitely in Europe, they'd say the EU has been the single most important factor in what's happened economically in Europe over the last 20 years. Well, these authors are saying, no, that's a misunderstanding. probably a little bit of hubris involved in that theory, and it probably emanates from academia and the central banks. But the reality is, well, they've had some influence, of course. Their point is that there have been these huge, overwhelming factors that changed the world in a dramatic way the last 30 years. And again, the primary factor, I guess they would list first, is the huge increase of workforce that has reduced the cost of products across the world for the last 30 years. You know, when Japan entered the world workforce, which as a practical matter, we'll say it occurred around 2000, which they had favored nation status. The U.S. reluctantly gave it. They joined the World Trade Organization, but the U.S., after China made a series of promises around the year 2000, agreed to give them most favored status. And that, incidentally, side note, they haven't kept any of those promises. But that's another show, another subject. So China gets this very valuable position in the world, this opportunity to sell, to manufacture products and send them around the world. Well, they did. They soaked up the intellectual property around the world. They acquired factories. They soaked up the technology. They brought in the manufacturers there, and at first the companies, they learned how to do it. And then some companies they let stay, others they threw out, and they did it themselves. But the point is, China had a huge impact. They increased, what was the percentage? I think it was 25% of the increase in the world's workforce. And actually, I think it was 50%. But I won't take the time to look this up here. So 25 to 50%, think about that impact. What would that do to prices? We were talking about what would happen if you increased the money supply 50% and it was actually spent. Well, it would cut prices in half, right? So that's kind of what happened with the workforce. And especially when you throw in, remember, we got an additional workforce from Eastern Europe. In 91, about the beginning of this 3-decade period, guess what? For the first time, Eastern Europe, the communist bloc, joins the world economy, joins the free economy of the world, the Western economy, we'll say. And that's a labor force, a huge labor force. So certainly between the two, we've added double the number of workers available to produce. But not only that, as to China especially, you have people who are willing to work much more cheaply, and it's a win-win proposition, incidentally. So those who complain that China doesn't enjoy the same, all the workers don't have the same benefits. I mean, you have to understand that from the worker standpoint, they're thankful. They're in a better position. Their life is improved. So we can't judge their standards by the U.S. So they profited, we profited, and that was a huge factor in the inability of the Federal Reserve to create inflation. And that, we talk about velocity, but that is a big factor, and it has to be considered. So the point of this book is to say that when you look at this impact on the workforce that allowed everything to be produced not just a little bit cheaper, dramatically cheaper than what it could otherwise be produced. And remember, we observed the impact of this in the advanced nations. In U.S. and Europe, labor unions, they almost went away. And you think, well, how'd that happen? Well, they lost bargaining power. They didn't have the bargaining power. A union could not do anything for its workers because companies had the option of offshoring, and many did offshore. And that was a phenomenon that was rampant the last 3 decades. And it did produce lower prices for consumers. But the manufacturing base in America went down substantially. But was it a net gain for the economy? Well, many would say yes. Even people who are displaced, some of the people who are displaced found new places to do new careers, to do what they do. Not everybody, but the bottom line is the economies in the West benefited from this ocean of new workers willing to manufacture cheaply. And another factor which kind of accompanies that is this thing called globalization. Was there world trade in the 40s? International trade? Yeah. Was it in the 50s? Yes, and 60s. But nothing like what we call globalization. Nothing like the freedom with which goods flowed in and out across borders for the last 30 years. We've not seen anything like that. The world hadn't seen anything like that. And it's due to telecommunications, it's due to communications, it's due to transportation, all of which are fueled by technology. So it wasn't just attitudinal, it was a lot about our capabilities. So this book, though, talks about the great demographic reversal, talks about, the last 30 years and how do we account for it? What were the most influential factors? And summing up, it's the huge increase of the world labor force, doubling of the world labor force. And then the other is this impact of globalization. Globalization, you put those two things together where you truly have assets that can freely flow, not just between states. Remember, that was a big deal, trading between states in Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, there were arguments about trade between states, just like countries. Can you imagine, how sticky and that it was and clunky to try to get anything done to where you can have goods flow freely and have genuine fair price competition, et cetera, all those wonderful things that produce benefits for consumers. I mean, and then you see what's happened the last 30 years. It's been a phenomenon that one could argue will be difficult, and if you believe these authors, will be impossible to replicate. So the final point, I'll wrap up here in the next 5 minutes. The final point, though, to this story of the great demographic reversal is those things that happened the last 30 years will not happen the next 30. That now the birth rate is not at a sufficiently high level to assure that procreation, that workforces stay at the levels that they have been, to have a sustainable birth rates like 2.1 children per couple in a nation. And China is way behind. China is going to face a serious crisis, which they're just now starting to recognize. They're scurrying to pass policies that in 2015, they authorized 2 children from 1. And now but they still had penalties if you violated that. And just right now, as I speak, there's pending legislation that's going to eliminate all penalties associated with it. And they're still they'll recommend 3 children, knowing that they can't get any more than that. I mean, they succeeded too well in persuading couples that, you can have a pretty, for lack of a better word, a selfish life as a couple. You can live for yourselves, and with 1 child, you don't spend a lot of money, and you can you still have money for a better retirement and travel and all that. If you have a bunch of kids, you can't. So they succeeded in communicating that message, and as a matter of fact, apparently Europe and the U.S. is too, but not in the same programmatic way that China has. So China really, I think that they do recognize at this stage, there's a lot of talk about it. Chairman Xi has been discussing this and others. So it is a crisis for China, and they can't allow their workforce to diminish further if they're going to maintain the lifestyle that's necessary for people that age. And that's kind of the punchline, the most critical message in this book is that these changes worldwide are demographic. They can't be reversed in time to prevent the problem. China, for example, to meet what's going to be the need of its labor force just to maintain its present standard of living they'd have to import the entire nation of Indonesia, for example. It's a huge number. It's not possible. So they are going to experience challenges on their standard of living due to the fact that their workforce will be so diminished. Same thing in America. It's not quite as difficult, or it's not quite as urgent in the United States, but it's here. EU is not in as good a position as the United States, but it's better than China. So this is a problem of the West. And there's simply not that residual workforce. It's just not there. And I won't get into explanations why. Well, there's Africa. There's still some people who might work cheaply. The authors speak at length about these alternatives, and they just don't work. They're not practical as to meet these largely technological needs that are going to exist around the world. So then on top of the fact that demography now, the next 30 years will not be what it has been, will be that globalization has suddenly been interrupted by these new borders. Now we're seeing a bit of a reversal of the free trade policies that existed for the most part around the world for the last 30 years. Unprecedented in world history. But now populism has gotten a foothold in many countries. Certainly we know it has in the United States, but it's not just here. Read about what's happening in Germany, these elections, and the influence of right-wing parties who are very protectionist. So protectionism seems to have gained a momentum in the U.S. and in Europe and in China. Gee, I mean, in China, it's almost militaristic at this stage. They're actually people who've invested in their tech companies are trying to bail out because they're realizing that the regulatory scheme in China, by which they have rules governing telecommunications and other technology that they think relates to privacy and data, we think that we have a bureaucratic process. Well, I can tell you theirs is an opaque box. I mean, it's a black box. And any day a company that you own or invest in there could be shut down. And, there is no Supreme Court, so to speak. There are no avenues by which one can seek real relief in China. These decisions are made in rooms behind closed doors by octogenarian men, and it's passed down like an edict. So right now, the idea of free trade, the way that we have in the last 30 years, I don't know that we'll see that again. But I don't think that we're going to see it in the near future, and I wouldn't count on it in the next couple of decades, at least being as good as. I'm not, by any means, I don't want to be perceived as being having a negative view of the future. I don't. I'm not a catastrophist. I don't think that the world is going to be a less desirable place in the future than it has been in the past. I'm an optimist in many ways, but at the same time, I think there are some ways in which it won't be as good, or for a while. So this author has persuaded me that these demographic forces can't be denied, and they argue one of the consequences of the demography coupled with decrease in globalization is there's going to be inflation. Their prediction is that this will produce inflation, and that there's nothing that the Fed, or for that matter, fiscal spending through Congress, can change. It's just a fact that we're going to have to pay more people for the care that comes. I'll throw in another fact relating to that is the book's great, and there's so much in there obviously I'm not covering, so the arguments are much better than I'm making to you. But one point that exacerbates this is that the nature of aging, which is what the population will disproportionately be over the next 10, 20, 30 years, is that the physical labor that's necessary, that's associated with aging, or the type of labor, is one that doesn't lend itself to automation. It's not likely to be the beneficiary of AI, for example. While there's wonderful technological developments moving along at a brisk pace, and they can accomplish a lot of things, and they will serve to mitigate these forces that I've been describing. I do think technology will mitigate this shortage of workers, but it won't come in time, is the argument of this book, to rescue us from experiencing some of these challenges and rescue us from some significant inflation. But the nature of caregiving is very personal. It's not likely to be something that we're going to be able to have lots of efficiency gains through technology. So it's very hands or human or effort intensive. And as a result, then it requires more people. And the argument is that as a percentage of the jobs in America, that's going to grow dramatically as people age and in larger numbers as well as get older. So when you have those forces at work, you can expect to need a substantially larger workforce dedicated to the care of the aged. So just throwing that on top of everything else that, of course, workforces have to continue to do that they've already been doing. So they predict then that there will be significant inflation over the next 10, for our purposes here, I'll assume your horizons are at least 10 years, 20, some of you 30. Maybe we should assume all of us 30 at least. So that means it should be real relevant to us, what's being discussed in this book. So maybe I've not persuaded you to read this book. I understand that. But those of you who are inclined to, it's not that difficult to read. It's a little difficult. These guys are academics, and so it is a bit of a trudge to get through some of it, but it can be read and understood. But I'm sure you can find summaries, and maybe you can find similar comments. But for my money, I'm going to bank on some continuing inflation for some time to come, and that's a different show when we talk about, once we take that as our predicate, what then do we focus on to invest in? Real estate interests me and has and continues to, but there are other things. And I need to have an investment expert on here. I'm not the investment expert. I'm just a guy who has an interest in these things. I hope that I'm helpful to you in talking about this. But we will have, and continue to have as we have in the past, investment advisors and others to comment on, if we assume inflation, tell us, what sectors should we focus on. It's a great show. We ought to line that up for sometime in the next, say, 6 weeks. Anyway, I hope this wasn't boring for you. I hope that you know a little bit more about this than you did before. Anyway, this has been another episode of Elder Talk. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Elder Talk with TuckerAllen, providing intelligent answers for those thinking about their future, with Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Listen again next Saturday for another edition of Elder Talk with TuckerAllen. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.